The message arrived at 9:17 a.m., while I was standing in line at the bank, waiting to deposit a check with both our names printed neatly across the front. I remember the fluorescent lights. The low hum of the counters. The way my phone vibrated once, casual, almost polite. I'm leaving you. I'm moving to Miami with my 20-year-old babe. I've already emptied our joint account. Haha. No call. No conversation. No warning. The teller smiled at me, still waiting for my signature. Two people behind me shifted impatiently. I could feel their presence, the ordinary rhythm of the world continuing, unaware that my marriage had just been reduced to 6 careless lines of text. I didn't cry. I didn't step out of line. I typed back only 2 words, "Good luck," and slid the check across the counter, already understanding something he didn't. Some exits feel like victories, until the door closes behind you. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something quietly. Have you ever been dismissed so casually that it felt unreal, like your life had been edited out mid-sentence? My name is Elizabeth. I was married for 12 years. I believed in shared accounts, shared plans, shared responsibility. I believed that endings required conversations. That morning taught me something else. Sometimes, silence is not weakness, it's preparation. I wasn't the kind of woman people warned others about. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand. I organized. I smoothed things over. I remembered birthdays, renewed policies, followed up on emails no one else wanted to send. In our marriage, I was the quiet infrastructure, unseen, essential. My husband, Mark, liked to say he was the visionary. He talked in big plans and loose timelines. I handled what those plans required: budgets, documents, reminders, patience. Our friends joked that I was lucky he was so driven. No one joked about who made sure the lights stayed on. I worked as a compliance analyst for a mid-sized logistics firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it trained my mind to notice patterns, inconsistencies, timing. I spent my days reviewing contracts, audit trails, and financial records, understanding not just what was written, but why it was written that way. At home, that translated into practical care. I managed our joint accounts. I tracked expenses. I kept copies of everything, not because I was suspicious, but because that's how I'd always lived, prepared, organized, responsible. Mark enjoyed the freedom that came with that. He liked knowing someone else was handling the details. He liked telling people he trusted me completely. What he never understood was that trust and awareness are not opposites. I gave more than I received, and I never counted it as a loss. I believed that balance didn't need to be loud to be real. But systems have limits. And when someone abuses them long enough, the structure they depend on becomes the very thing that exposes them. The changes didn't arrive dramatically. They came disguised as confidence. Mark stopped asking before making decisions. Small ones at first, booking trips without checking dates, moving money between accounts without mentioning it. When I asked, he laughed it off. Relax, Elizabeth. It's our money. He started using our the way someone uses a shield. At dinners with friends, he interrupted me mid-sentence, correcting details that didn't need correcting. If I gently pushed back, he smiled and turned it into a joke. Everyone laughed. I learned to stop finishing my thoughts. At home, he grew impatient with questions. If I asked about an unfamiliar charge or a new account notification, his tone sharpened. Why are you interrogating me? Don't you trust me? That word again, trust, used not as a bond, but as a boundary I wasn't allowed to cross. Once, I mentioned that our joint savings had dipped below the threshold we'd agreed on. He waved his hand. I'm investing in us. You worry too much. I noticed he'd changed the recovery email on one of our shared platforms. When I asked why, he said it was for security reasons. The explanation didn't make sense. I let it go anyway. Not because I believed him, but because I wanted to understand the pattern before reacting. People think silence means ignorance. Sometimes it means data collection. I began saving screenshots. Downloading monthly statements. Logging dates. Not to accuse him, but to anchor myself to facts when my instincts were being slowly questioned. By then, Mark had already mistaken my composure for compliance. And confidence, when unearned, has a way of becoming reckless. After the text, Mark stopped pretending. He didn't call. He didn't explain. Instead, he performed his exit the way he did everything else, loudly, carelessly, and with an audience he assumed would applaud him. Within days, mutual friends started reaching out, confused but cautious. Someone had seen his posts, photos in Miami, captions about choosing happiness, a younger woman cropped carefully into the frame. He wrote as if he were shedding something burdensome, something old. Me. When people asked what happened, he told them I was cold, controlling, too focused on paperwork to understand real life. He said I'd pushed him away. He said the marriage had been dead for years. No one called to ask if that was true. At the bank, I was treated like an inconvenience. The joint account was empty. The representative spoke slowly, as if I might not understand. Legally, he was within his rights to withdraw the funds. I nodded. I thanked her. I asked for printed confirmation. Mark emailed me once, 3 days after the text. Not an apology. A warning. Don't try anything stupid. The money's gone. It's over. I didn't reply. What he didn't realize was that dismissal cuts both ways. While he was busy narrating his freedom, he stopped paying attention to me entirely. He assumed I was embarrassed. Broken. Quiet because I had nothing left. That assumption gave me room. I contacted a family law attorney, not to fight, but to listen. I asked questions carefully. I didn't mention revenge. I mentioned documentation. Timelines. Digital trails. Every answer confirmed what I already suspected. Mark thought the story was finished because he'd spoken last. But stories like this don't end with noise. They end with records. The quiet afterward was heavier than the text itself. When a marriage ends loudly, people rush in. When it ends like mine did, through a screen, with a joke at the end, people hesitate. They don't know where to stand, so they stand back. Friends I'd hosted, supported, remembered, suddenly needed time. Conversations shortened. Invitations stopped. I understood the logic. Mark had already explained things. Reaching out to me would mean questioning his version, and questioning takes effort. Some nights, I replayed the message in my head, wondering if I'd missed something obvious years ago. Not because I believed his words, but because repetition has weight. When enough people act as if you're the problem, you begin checking yourself for cracks. I questioned my calm. I questioned my restraint. I questioned whether being composed had made me invisible. At work, I functioned normally. No one knew. I didn't want sympathy, and I didn't want advice. I wanted my mind clear. Emotion has a way of blurring facts if you let it roam unchecked. Still, there were moments, standing alone in the kitchen, hearing my phone buzz with notifications that weren't for me anymore, when doubt crept in quietly. Was I foolish for trusting him? Was preparation just another word for control? Then I opened my files. Bank statements. Account agreements. Screenshots with timestamps. A full audit trail of what had been joint, when it changed, and how quickly. Facts don't soothe emotions, but they stabilize them. They remind you that reality exists outside of narrative. I stopped trying to explain myself to people who hadn't asked. I stopped defending my silence. Isolation can hollow you out, or it can become a room where you hear yourself think. I chose the second. And slowly, clarity replaced confusion. The first official letter arrived 6 weeks later. Mark had filed for divorce in Florida. Unilaterally. Strategically. His attorney's language was sharp and confident, as if the outcome were already settled. The filing listed the joint account balance as 0. It framed his relocation as permanent, necessary, inevitable. He was asking for speed. When my attorney reviewed it, she didn't sugarcoat anything. Jurisdiction would be complicated. Recovering funds wouldn't be immediate. And yes, on paper, Mark looked like someone who'd already won. That was the moment people expect collapse. Even I felt it, briefly. A tightening in the chest. The understanding that fairness doesn't arrive on time just because you deserve it. That systems reward initiative, not morality. Friends who'd stayed neutral began suggesting I move on. A relative told me quietly that fighting would only make me look bitter. He's already gone, Elizabeth. Let it rest. Mark sent another message, not directly this time, but through his attorney. A proposed settlement that assumed I'd accept less than half, no contest, no review of the withdrawal. The implication was clear: sign now, avoid humiliation later. I didn't respond. That silence unsettled him more than any argument would have. Still, to the outside world, it looked like surrender. He was in Miami. I was alone. The money was gone. The paperwork favored him. Even my lawyer warned that outcomes like this could drag on for years. What no one saw, what even Mark couldn't imagine, was that I wasn't measuring progress by outcomes yet. I was measuring leverage. And leverage doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It waits, quietly, until the other side stops watching. I didn't retreat from my life. I narrowed it. I stopped explaining my situation to people who asked out of curiosity rather than concern. I answered emails at work with the same precision as always. I kept my routines intact, not out of denial, but discipline. Each evening, I reviewed documents. Not obsessively. Methodically. I traced the money's movement from our joint account into a newly opened individual account in Mark's name. I noted the timing, 3 transfers, all within a single hour. I cross-referenced those with the account agreement we'd signed years earlier. There it was. A clause most people skim past. Large withdrawals from joint accounts required mutual written acknowledgement if tied to marital assets exceeding a certain threshold. The clause existed to protect both parties in the event of separation or incapacity. Mark had signed it. So had I. I didn't celebrate. I highlighted it. I requested certified copies of the account opening documents. I filed a quiet inquiry with the bank's compliance department, not a complaint, just a request for internal review. I used neutral language. No emotion. No accusation. At the same time, I asked my attorney to request discovery, limited, precise, unthreatening. Transaction logs. IP addresses. Authorization records. Mark didn't notice. He was busy building a new life, telling people the past had been handled. He assumed my calm meant exhaustion. That I'd accepted reality. Endurance isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like strength until it's tested. It looks like patience. Like routine. Like someone who understands that timing matters more than speed. I didn't need to rush him. He was already moving exactly where I needed him to be. The more distance I gained from the shock, the clearer the pattern became. Mark hadn't just left impulsively. He'd rehearsed it, financially, emotionally, socially. The confidence in his text wasn't arrogance, it was rehearsal delivered without an audience. When I mapped his behavior backward, it aligned too neatly to be coincidence. The casual transfers. The changed recovery emails. The sudden impatience with questions. Even the Miami move, it wasn't spontaneous. It was the final step of a plan that had been forming while I was still believing in routine. What shifted wasn't my understanding of him. It was my understanding of myself. I stopped asking why he'd done it and started asking how he'd assumed he could get away with it. That question sharpened everything. His withdrawal timing matched a compliance window most people don't know exists, a period when banks are required to flag unusual activity but often act only after internal review. His account had been opened less than a week earlier. His IP address showed consistent access from our shared home network until 2 days before the text. That mattered. I began to see the story he was telling and the story the data was telling. They didn't match. Emotionally, something else changed too. I no longer felt the need to correct his version of events publicly. His confidence depended on my reaction. Without it, his narrative floated unsupported. I wasn't angry. I was focused. Awareness is quiet. It doesn't demand action immediately. It asks you to watch longer than is comfortable, to let repetition expose intent. By the time Mark posted another photo from Miami, captioned "New Chapter," I wasn't reading it as a provocation. I was reading it as confirmation. He believed the door behind him was closed. What he didn't realize was that he'd left fingerprints on the handle. There was one detail I hadn't shared with anyone, not my attorney, not my closest friend. 6 months before Mark left, my firm had conducted an internal training on financial misconduct and marital asset diversion. It was part of a broader compliance update, dry and technical, the kind people half listen to while checking email. I'd paid attention. One case study in particular stayed with me, a spouse draining a joint account immediately before filing for divorce, assuming joint access meant immunity. The presenter had been precise. Joint access does not negate fiduciary duty once intent to separate can be established. Intent leaves traces. I went back through our shared calendar. Mark's travel bookings. His lease inquiry emails, sent from our home IP address weeks before the withdrawal. A casual text to a friend about starting fresh soon. None of it dramatic on its own. Together, it formed a timeline. I didn't need to prove malice. I needed to establish sequence. Then there was the bank call. A compliance officer returned my earlier inquiry, neutral but attentive. She asked if I was alleging unauthorized activity. I said no. I said I was asking whether internal safeguards had been followed. That phrasing mattered. Within days, the bank initiated a routine internal review. No one notified Mark. No alerts. No flags he could see. That's how these things work. They begin quietly, behind the interface customers assume is transparent. I requested nothing publicly. I posted nothing. I let Mark continue believing the story was over. The advantage wasn't just documentation. It was timing. By the time my attorney formally requested a financial injunction to freeze disputed assets, the bank already had its own questions. Independent processes moving toward the same conclusion. Mark still thought I was behind. Still thought silence meant surrender. Some truths don't need confrontation. They only need to be placed in the right hands and given time to surface. Something subtle changed in me once I stopped needing to be believed. For weeks, I'd imagined what I might say if someone finally asked for my side. I'd rehearsed explanations, clarifications, even restrained anger. But as the process unfolded, quietly, procedurally, that impulse faded. I didn't need to persuade anyone anymore. I trusted the sequence. The documents. The fact that systems, when engaged correctly, don't respond to emotion, they respond to consistency. My posture changed. Not visibly, but internally. I stopped checking Mark's social media. I stopped bracing for messages that never came. His silence no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like distance, useful, necessary distance. At work, I noticed I was more decisive. Less apologetic. I spoke when needed and stopped when finished. People responded differently, not because I was louder, but because I was clear. That clarity followed me home. I no longer framed my endurance as patience. It was agency. I was choosing stillness because movement too early would have disrupted the momentum already in motion. I understood now that power isn't reactive. It doesn't flare. It accumulates. Mark had mistaken my emotional restraint for weakness because he didn't recognize it as self-governance. He'd assumed that because I wasn't fighting him publicly, I wasn't fighting at all. That assumption had cost him awareness. I began sleeping through the night again. Eating regularly. The tightness in my chest eased, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because I was no longer guessing. Transformation doesn't announce itself. It arrives as calm where panic used to live. I wasn't waiting for justice to happen to me. I was already participating in it. By the time my attorney suggested we consider next steps, I already knew what they would be. Preparation didn't mean escalation. It meant alignment. We filed a narrowly tailored motion requesting a temporary financial injunction, nothing aggressive, nothing sensational. The language was neutral. The request simple: preserve the status quo until asset division could be reviewed. It didn't accuse Mark of theft. It didn't speculate about intent. It referenced dates, amounts, and contractual obligations. Facts don't need adjectives. At the same time, I finalized a complete financial affidavit. Every account. Every policy. Every digital access point. I included the screenshots, the IP logs, the timeline. Not as evidence yet, just readiness. The bank's internal review was still ongoing. That was intentional. Independent processes carry more weight when they converge naturally. Mark, unaware, filed a response through his attorney that was confident and sloppy. He repeated claims that contradicted his own transaction records. He asserted that the withdrawals had been mutually understood. He submitted no proof. Overreach often happens when someone believes they're unobserved. I didn't correct him. I let his words exist alongside the data. Meanwhile, I requested that all future communication go through counsel. Not to shut him out, but to remove performance from the equation. He could no longer test reactions or provoke responses. Silence became procedural. The final piece of preparation wasn't legal. It was emotional. I let go of the desire to win in the way people imagine winning. I focused on resolution. On correction. On restoring balance, not through punishment, but exposure. Mark had built his confidence on speed. On the assumption that I'd be too shocked to respond strategically. He was wrong. I wasn't waiting to strike. I was waiting for the moment when everything he'd already done would speak for itself. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, virtual but formal. Same system Mark had used to file first. Same jurisdiction he thought gave him control. He logged in late. I noticed that before anything else. He looked relaxed, almost bored, seated in what I assumed was a rental apartment in Miami. He smiled at his attorney, leaned back in his chair. Confidence radiated from him, not the calm kind, but the careless kind that assumes the work is already done. I logged in quietly. Camera on. Neutral background. Documents arranged off-screen. My attorney greeted the court. I said nothing. This was the same dynamic Mark remembered, me composed, observant, letting others take the spotlight. I could almost see the assumption forming. She's still the same. The judge outlined the purpose of the hearing. Asset preservation. Jurisdictional clarity. Procedural matters. Mark's attorney spoke first. He framed the withdrawals as ordinary. Mutual. Irreversible. He emphasized relocation, new employment prospects, a clean break. No one interrupted him. Then my attorney responded. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She presented a sequence. Dates. Amounts. Agreements. She referenced the joint account clause. The timing of the transfers. The pending internal bank review, introduced not as an allegation, but as context. That was the first moment Mark leaned forward. The power arena wasn't the courtroom itself. It was the record. Once something enters it, confidence becomes irrelevant. For the first time since the text message, Mark wasn't narrating the story. He was reacting to it. And reactions, unlike plans, are difficult to control. Mark's confidence, once effortless, began to falter under the weight of facts. He tried to interject during the hearing, leaning forward, voice sharper than before. Your Honor, these withdrawals were authorized, mutually agreed. But the documentation already told a different story. Emails, timestamps, account logs, they lined up precisely against his claims. Each claim he made created a gap between his story and reality. He had assumed that boldness would mask evidence. That arrogance could overwrite process. That confidence alone could control perception. When the judge asked him to confirm the IP records and dates, his hands fumbled over papers. His face reddened as the sequences were read aloud. His attorney coughed, trying to regain composure, but the facts were already moving ahead of their narrative. Outside the hearing, his social media was still performing the carefree new life act. He didn't realize that credibility isn't performed, it's earned. And every post, every boast about freedom, now worked against him. Mark's overreach had been subtle but consistent. He'd drained the account assuming technicality would shield him. He'd overestimated silence, overestimated my supposed submission. Every small misstep he believed hidden was documented. Every confident move became a trigger. I didn't interrupt. I didn't lecture. I observed quietly. My attorney, steady and composed, presented the sequence like clockwork. No emotion. No drama. Only fact, only procedure, only undeniable sequence. Power doesn't need theatrics. Overconfidence, when unchallenged, destroys itself. And Mark, assuming mastery, had given me the most valuable tool, his own misjudgment. By the end of the session, he was visibly unsettled. He realized, slowly, that control had shifted, not because I acted dramatically, but because I acted methodically. Sometimes, the loudest collapse begins with silence. The final documents were presented quietly, almost without fanfare. Each line, each timestamp, each signature told the story Mark had tried to overwrite. No speeches. No confrontations. Just facts. The judge reviewed the sequence aloud: joint account agreements, timestamps of withdrawals, IP addresses, email confirmations, internal bank review notes. Everything lined up. Everything contradicted Mark's claims. Mark tried to speak again, but his attorney held up a hand, signaling restraint. The judge paused, looked at him, and then turned back to the documents. I didn't need to say a word. All the months of careful observation, the screenshots, the timeline, the professional guidance, it spoke for me. The court didn't need my anger. It didn't need my emotion. It needed precision. And precision doesn't lie. Mark's voice faltered when the judge asked if he could explain the discrepancies. He fumbled phrases, repeated justifications, excuses. The more he explained, the clearer it became. He had assumed silence was submission, speed was power, and arrogance was proof. He was wrong. The injunction was granted. Assets frozen. Pending litigation favored careful documentation over bravado. Any further attempt to move funds unilaterally would be legally reversed. The money he thought lost to me had already been accounted for. Procedural safeguards ensured that what was rightfully mine could not be erased by ego or haste. Outside the courtroom, the reality hit him in small increments: emails from the bank, notifications from legal counsel, confirmations of timelines and freezes. Each one was quiet. Each one irreversible. The truth had been released. And it didn't need drama to sting. For the first time since that careless text, Mark understood. Control had never been his. It had always been mine. Quiet, patient, unshakable. He had acted hastily. He had believed he was clever. But he had underestimated the power of restraint, preparation, and precise timing. The text that had once humiliated me now sat silently in history. And in its place stood something far stronger: verified, undeniable, and irrevocable justice. By the time news of the injunction reached our mutual circle, Mark's carefully constructed image began to unravel. Friends who had applauded his freedom now paused, unsure of what to believe. The social media posts, meant to broadcast happiness, instead drew skeptical comments and quiet inquiries. The narrative he had crafted so confidently no longer held. In conversations, colleagues and acquaintances asked cautious questions. The confident tone he once commanded was replaced by awkward silences and half-explanations. People were hearing facts, not his version. Even those who had not followed the legal details could sense the shift. Reputation, once inflated by arrogance and assumption, collapses faster than pride alone. And Mark's had done exactly that. I attended a virtual family dinner weeks later, not to gloat, not to humiliate, but to observe. He stumbled over explanations, avoiding eye contact. Those who had once nodded at his version now looked elsewhere. The dissonance was quiet but complete. He tried to joke, to perform the nonchalance he had mastered for months, but the room no longer responded. Confidence, when contradicted by evidence, becomes hollow. The beauty of this collapse wasn't cruelty, it was truth finally occupying the space arrogance had claimed. Mark's facade fell not because I shouted, not because I exposed him publicly, but because the systems he'd ignored were finally doing their work. And I realized something profound. Victory doesn't require noise. It requires patience, precision, and the quiet certainty that comes from knowing you are right, and that the facts will eventually speak for themselves. Mark's collapse was public, but not theatrical. It was procedural, inevitable, and irreversible. And for the first time since that text message, I felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with me. The aftermath was understated but definitive. Mark's attempts to move forward without accountability were stalled. Any financial maneuver he tried was automatically reviewed. The legal injunction ensured that unilateral decisions over shared assets were impossible. His confidence had been replaced by caution. He now operated within boundaries he had assumed didn't exist. Mutual friends and colleagues began to see a different picture. They noticed my composure, my preparation, and the fact that I had never needed to dramatize my response. Respect, previously quiet, now emerged naturally. People understood that I hadn't acted impulsively, I had acted with precision. Even in social settings, Mark's attempts to assert influence fell flat. He realized too late that control isn't maintained by volume or charm, it's earned through consistency, integrity, and preparedness. At work, my reputation strengthened. My ability to remain calm under pressure, to navigate complex situations without panic, became a subtle but undeniable testament to competence. And personally, I felt lighter. The months of observation, documentation, and restraint had paid off. I had preserved what mattered, restored balance, and done so without compromising my own dignity. Power, I learned, doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers, measured and deliberate, and the effects echo far beyond the moment. Sitting quietly in my home weeks later, I reflected on everything that had happened. The text message that had once cut so sharply now felt like a turning point, not an end. I realized that dignity isn't found in retaliation or in proving someone wrong loudly. It is found in preparation, in restraint, and in allowing truth to unfold through systems stronger than anger. Mark had underestimated me, as many people do when they mistake calm for weakness. But calm, coupled with awareness and strategic action, becomes unstoppable. I had endured humiliation, confusion, and isolation. I had transformed those moments into clarity, leverage, and finally, quiet justice. The money, the reputation, the equilibrium, all restored. More importantly, I had regained control over my own life and narrative. Justice had arrived, not through spectacle, but through patience, intelligence, and integrity. And in that silence, I found something even more profound: freedom. No words of victory were needed. The facts had spoken. And for the first time in months, I could finally breathe, knowing that dignity and preparation had won where noise and arrogance had failed.